Welcome to the HR Toolbox, the podcast where we help you build your toolbox of resources, best practices, and strategies shaping the world of HR and business today. Whether you're an HR professional, small business owner, office manager, or someone wanting to learn more about today's work environment, we're here to help. Each week, we take a dive into our HR Toolbox to bring you an in-depth look at a different HR topic, regulation, or business solution. Send us an email at hrtoolboxpod@gmail.com to suggest a topic or resource tool. The HR Toolbox is here to help businesses stay compliant and competitive. I am your host, Amy Alden. I am committed to your business success one tool at a time. Let's dive in and see what we can find in our HR Toolbox this week. This episode is part 2 of our discussion on the USCIS I-9 form. We are going to discuss best practices for retention, as well as how to prepare for and what to do if you're audited. Coming up on the calendar, National Mom and Pop Business Owners Day is March 29th. Mom and pop businesses are the vision of a true small business. They are small, family-owned or independently owned businesses. And even though the HR Toolbox celebrates small businesses every day, March 29th gives us a reason to do so even louder. We know that 49% of small businesses have just 1 to 4 workers. So that's about 3 million businesses in the United States that are less than 4 workers. So take the day to visit a mom and pop shop. They are all around us. Let us know what your favorite mom and pop stores are. Share their story at HR Toolbox Pod. National Pencil Day is coming up on March 30th. Now, I'm old school with my calendar, and I still keep a handwritten version. For me, it helps me with effective scheduling at a glance, allows for more productive time boxing, and it reduces my stress level from my type A over-planning brain. And the way it works well is to have it in pencil. I appreciate a good mechanical pencil with a good eraser. So for this special day, celebrating pencils, I will be refilling my mechanical pencils and reveling in the interesting fact that during its lifetime, a typical pencil can write approximately 45,000 words and draw a line up to 35 miles long. Imagine crossing stuff off your to-do list with that. Also coming up is Walk to Work Day on April 4th. This is a day to get outside and get your steps in. Walk to Work Day was founded in 2004, and walking has many positive effects on your health. It engages over 200 muscles, can improve your memory, your sleep, and your mood. If walking to work is not possible, you can plan to have your office walk to a lunch location and back again. Have a nice team meal. If you are a remote, hybrid, work-from-home employee like I am, get started a little earlier and take a walk around your work location before getting your workday started. Stretch those muscles and clear the mind. Our definition of the week: audit. An audit is a systematic and independent review of financial records, statements, and operations. The goal is to verify the accuracy and compliance with standards. There are several types of audits. There are financial audits that look at financial statements and determine legality of expenditures. There's operational audits. Those assess the efficiency and effectiveness of an organization's operations. And we have compliance audits. They verify that an organization is following relevant laws, regulations, and policies. We can also have different types of audits. We can have an internal audit where it's conducted by an employee of the organization, or an external audit that's conducted by outside professionals such as accountants or auditors. In this episode, we're going to follow up on our Form I-9. What happens if you're looking over the I-9s and you realize that, there's an error or something's missing? What can you do? Well, we do want to make sure that all parts of the I-9 are completed properly, because we know that we may be subject to penalties under federal law if it's not completed correctly. So there's a couple of things we can do. If we find an error in Section 1, we talked about Section 1, this is the part that the employee fills out. So if we discover that there's an error or we see that something's missing in Section 1, then we need to ask the employee to correct the error or add the missing information. only the employee or their preparer or translator can correct any errors or omissions in Section 1. Only the employee. Employers cannot change the information in this section. So we want to ask the employee to draw a line through the incorrect information, enter the correct or missing information, and then initial and date the correction. And then we should attach a written explanation of why information was missing or needed correcting. Now, what happens if you're looking over your I-9 forms, because you do keep them past the employee's time with your company? So what if your employee is no longer there? Their employment is ended, and you see as you're going through that, there's an issue there. In that instance, then we would just have a signed and dated statement that identifies the error or omission, and we attach it to the existing form and explain why corrections could not be made. For example, the employee no longer works here, so that's why we couldn't ask them to correct this form. Now, if you see an error or missing information in either Section 2, which is the employer section, or in Supplement B, used to be Section 3, then this is something that you can fix. So what we have in this instance is that the employer or your authorized rep can make corrections in Section 2 or Supplement B, which is a re-verification and rehires. And basically it's the same thing. If you discover an error or missing information, draw a line through the incorrect info, enter the correct or missing information, initial and date the correction or missing information that was filled in, and then you should still attach a written explanation of why information was missing or needed correcting. Because if you fail to enter the date you completed Section 2, and you should still attach a written explanation of why information was missing or needed correcting. Now, what should you do if you forgot to enter the date you completed Section 2? So we talked about this. Section 2 has to be completed within 3 days of the person starting. Or what if you forget to put a date in Supplement B when you're doing the re-verification or rehire process and you didn't put a date in when you went and got the new information, which has to be before that expiration date. Very important. You should not, don't backdate the form. Instead, enter the current date and initial by the date field. And again, write a written explanation of why it is what it is and attach it to the back of the form. Now, if you have multiple errors, one whole section is just not correct, you could redo that whole section on a new I-9 form and attach it to the old form. You also have the ability to complete a whole new I-9 form if it contains substantial errors. Entire sections left blank. A whole thing of unacceptable documents being written in. But again, you should attach a written explanation to the I-9 form describing why you made changes or why you started a whole new form. If you do make any changes on the form, do not try to conceal them. Don't try to erase it, although you should be filling those out in pen, so I don't know how well you're going to be erasing it. But don't use any whiteout or correction tape or anything like that, because when you do that, it does lead to increased liability under federal immigration law. So if you made the changes, really, truly, cross it out, initial, date, attach a signed and dated explanation of why you made changes. If you use an electronic I-9 form, your audit trail should reflect all the corrections and additions made in both Sections 1 and 2 and Supplements A and B. So again, if we're talking about you guys have HR software or a hiring company or something that is handling this I-9 form process for you, make sure, one, they're using the correct form, but also make sure that if any changes are happening to those forms, that all of those corrections and changes are being recorded and that there is an audit trail. You can ask those companies if they provide that. If they do not, go back to paper forms or find a different company that can help you with those situations. Now we're going to get into I-9 storage and retention best practices. You have a couple of options. You can choose to copy or scan the documents that the employee presents when completing the I-9 form, but you need to make sure that you retain those copies or electronic images. If you've got JPEGs in your computer, that's fine. Make sure that you're filing that all together with their I-9 form. We also want to make sure that you're making copies of the employee's documents does not take the place of completing the I-9 form. Just because they bring you the documents and you've looked at it and you make a copy of the documents and you file it all away, not completed the I-9, you still must do that. You're still required to fully complete and retain the I-9 form. I would say that best practices, make the copies. Have the copies. There's nothing saying you can't have those copies. For any business practice that I would have, I have made those copies, but the biggest thing is making sure that those documents that prove identity, that prove work authorization, they stay with that I-9 form. They don't get filed anywhere else. Now, if you choose to make copies of the employee's documents for reasons not related to E-Verify or I-9s, not a great practice. We don't want to be seen as violating anti-discrimination laws. We don't want to be perceived or actually discriminate against national origin, citizenship, or immigration status. So if you're in the practice of using these documents for something else, not a good idea. You're not doing anything legal there. You probably need to change business practices or talk with a lawyer. We want to know, though, that you never want to dispose of a current employee's I-9 form or any copies that you made of the employee's I-9 documentation. You must keep these records for as long as the employees work for you and for a certain amount of time after they stop working for you. And we will go into the details of what those retention timeframes are. You can retain paper forms with the original handwritten signatures. You can either keep them on site, you can keep them in an off-site storage, you can scan them into electronic databases. But as long as you are able to present the I-9 forms within 3 business days of an inspection request from DHS, the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, Immigration and Employee Rights Section, or the U.S. Department of Labor officers, as long as you're able to provide all of your forms within 3 business days, then there's not a lot of strict guidelines on how you have to maintain or where you have to store these documents. But we're going to go into some options that you have and what might be best practices for you. Now, again, if you're making electronic images of the employee's documents, retain them with the corresponding I-9 form and make sure that you're maintaining them to the electronic records retention standards. Again, even if you have electronic images, you must make them available at the time that an I-9 inspection is happening by DHS, DOJ, or DOL. And you have 3 days to present those. So a big question that we get asked is, should I-9 forms be filed separately from personnel files? It is a resounding yes. Yes. Never put your I-9 forms and the corresponding documentation inside the personnel files, because when you mix the I-9 and the documents with the personnel files, you're risking discrimination claims, you're risking audit delays. So best practices, you're keeping those I-9 forms separate from personnel files because it makes it easier to comply with audits and inspections. If U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, or Department of Homeland Security, DHS, audits your business, they're going to request I-9s. And when you're keeping them separate, it allows for quick retrieval without exposing unnecessary employee information. It protects the employee's privacy, like we just talked about. Personnel files contain sensitive information. It contains salary, performance reviews, could contain medical records, as part of a separate section of your personnel files. So keeping your I-9 separate, it limits access to only those responsible for employment verification. It also reduces legal risks. Because the I-9 form contains work authorization status, it could expose companies to discrimination claims if you're mixing all of that documentation in with personnel records. So you want to make sure that your I-9s are kept apart to reduce the risk of unintentional bias in HR or hiring decisions, even promotion decisions. You don't want any of that work authorization status coming into effect in their employment history. It also simplifies retention and disposal. So we talked about what the retention rules were, and the I-9s must be kept for 3 years after hire or 1 year after termination, whichever is later. Now, this is different than other HR documents. The time frames are different. So if you file your I-9 separately or you store them separately, it's much easier to track when they need to be purged without affecting other HR documents. So let's talk about the best ways to store your I-9 forms. There's many different ways. You can do a paper system, you can do an electronic system. Let's dig into those a little bit. So if you're using a paper filing system, if you're storing physical I-9 forms with copies of the documentation presented, like we just talked about, we are storing those separate from personnel files. But we want to organize them in one way. We are going to have 2 separate areas. Now, you could have folders, you could have binders, you could have a drawer set aside. It really depends on how many I-9s, what your hiring is, what your turnover is, how many you're processing on a regular basis. If you're only doing, 1 or 2 new I-9s per year, small binder, you can have a divider in between. But we're having 2 separate areas where we have active employees in our I-9 folder. So all of our current employees in one section. And then the next section is all of our terminated employees. And we're storing those terminated employees, those separated employees, until it is time to end the required retention period. We can organize the I-9s alphabetically or by hire date. I typically do alphabetical. It makes it much easier to locate by employee name. I find that it works, especially if you're trying to locate a particular employee. There are options to organize it by hire date because it helps track when the forms need to be purged. I think that you can do that just as easily if you use a retention tracker. So that's just a simple log or a spreadsheet where you track when the I-9 expiration is and what the destruction date should be. So we're talking 3 years after hire or 1 year after termination, whichever is later. If you only have a couple of I-9s in your termination section of your I-9 folders or drawer or binder, however you're retaining those, if you just have a couple, one thing I would say, instead of using a retention tracker, just put a little post-it in the corner of what the date is that it needs to be destroyed. And then just make sure that you have a regular occurrence of going through and finding any of those who have met that date and then purging them out of your terminated employees I-9 folder. And then really important is making sure that they are stored in a secure location. So keeping it in a locked cabinet that's only accessible to authorized personnel, restrict the access to HR and compliance staff only. If you're putting them in binders, make sure they're either in a cabinet that could be locked or in an office that could be secured when not occupied by restricted access staff. So however you choose to store them, just make sure. I mean, think about the things that you have with these I-9s. You could have passport data, you could have social security card numbers, you can have driver's license, you could have work authorization forms. There's a lot of sensitive data in these I-9s and in that documentation that goes with it. So making sure that you're securing this stuff in a location is very important. Now, you could store everything electronically as well. You have that. Digital storage is an option. And the guidelines that you want to think about with the electronic storage is just make sure that you're complying with DHS and ICE electronic I-9 storage requirements, which means that you're using an I-9 compliant digital system. That system should allow indexing and searching, again, so you can have quick retrieval. If you're asked for these, you do have a timeline in which you need to be able to access this information and provide it during an audit. Making sure that we have those audit trails. We talked about that as well. If you're making corrections, if you're filling in missing information and anything's changing, you want to make sure that you have audit trails so that you can track those changes. And then you also need to make sure that there are secure backups, because you are responsible for having this. If you get audited, you can't say, oh, my system crashed and I don't have any of that information. It's not going to fly. So just make sure that if you are storing them electronically, digitally, make sure that you can get to them quickly, that you're able to index and search, that it keeps track of any changes, and that there are backups to wherever those files are being saved. So there are some examples. There's a lot of HR software that has built-in I-9 management. So ADP has it, Workday has it, Paychex has it. So you can find one of those softwares that are able to handle that. Just make sure they're complying with those steps that they need to in order to be compliant with both DHS and ICE. So if you're using a secure cloud-based document management system, that's also an option. But you want to make sure that in there that the I-9s are in a restricted digital folder, that you have a separate active employees and terminated employees section of the I-9 documentation. So, and again, we're restricting access to either an authorized HR or compliance personnel only. And you want to see if that system can set up automatic retention and purge dates. So again, we need to be able to say when we get to that retention period expiration that we're purging that data out of our software, that we don't have that information, that sensitive information, still retrievable. So you can use digital reminders or HR software that has those automatic retention and purge dates built in. We keep talking about retention requirements, but I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page. If you have an employee that has worked for less than 2 years, then you retain their form for 3 years after the date you entered the first date of employment. Or if they worked more than 2 years, you're retaining their form for 1 year after the date they stopped working for you. So, easy way to remember, 3 years after hire or 1 year after termination, whichever is later. So we talked about ways that you can track expiration and destruction dates for the I-9 forms. It really depends on the size of your company. It really depends on how many terminated employees when we talk about the destruction dates. If you only have a couple, like I said earlier, Post-its are a really easy way to just put on this is the destruction date. But you do need to have a way to go back and check any expiration dates on any of the work authorization paperwork. If you have a employee tracking system or an employee HRIS program that you have a lot of either compliance data in or anniversary dates in that automatically allow you to run reports to let you know when things are happening, this would be one of those times that you want to enter those dates in to get regular reports of, hey, this person's work authorization information is expiring. So you want to make sure that you're all over it because you are responsible if you are retaining these employees after work authorization ends and you don't have a receipt that they've applied for an extension or a new document, and you've not gotten that new document, you are now illegally employing somebody who's not, when we look at the paperwork, they're not authorized to work in the United States. They may be, but we didn't follow up and get that re-verification process done. So whatever system you have, we do need to figure out a way that we are being notified when one of those expiration dates are coming in. You want to give yourself good 30 to 60 days. One thing that you could do if you don't have an employee system that tracks all of that information, use Outlook. Put in calendar reminders to remind yourself to circle back around and talk with those employees to say, hey, I just want to make sure you're working on getting your new documentation because I need to update it in my system. So it's very important. There's many different ways that you can do it. It really depends on your size, the turnover, the amount of I-9s that you have, and which systems you might already have in place for tracking important dates. We talk about these I-9 audits and the compliance reviews. So what should you do if you are audited for I-9 compliance? Well, so the first thing we want to know is that the agencies that would actually audit you could be the Department of Homeland Security, could be ICE, it could be another agency we talked about before, maybe DOL if they're looking at visa compliance. But the first thing you want to know is understand that you're going to get a notice, and you're going to receive a notice of inspection. And that will usually give you 3 days to prepare for your I-9 audit. So you want to, once you receive that notice, review and organize your I-9s. Make sure that all your forms are complete. Make sure they're accurate. Make sure that you have your separate active and former employees. So that way it's easier to be reviewed. Make sure you're identifying and correcting any minor errors using the correction process we talked about before. Don't backdate anything. But you also want to know that Homeland Security Investigations, HSI, they generally request that the employer also provide supporting documentation. So this could also include any document copies that you've made, but it's not limited to. They might ask for a copy of your payroll. They might ask for a list of active and terminated employees. They may ask for articles of incorporation, and they might ask for business licenses. And all of that is part of their I-9 compliance audit. They should let you know ahead of time if they're requesting all of that other stuff, but just be prepared that they might not have told you ahead, but it is something that would be in supporting of their audit that you do need to provide. If you want, you could seek legal assistance, maybe consult with an immigration or employment attorney to ensure that you're compliant and reducing any risks that you might have. And then just remember to respond professionally. We want to cooperate with the auditors, but we don't want to provide more information than what's required. They're there to inspect the I-9s. Let's inspect the I-9s. Let's go through and provide anything that they would need to go through that. Another good reason not to have the I-9s inside your personnel folders. But if you do have an audit, you're going to have a couple of different outcomes. You could receive a notice of inspection results. This is also known as a compliance letter. This usually is just a notice that you receive that you are in compliance, that everything checked out, all of the employee eligibility verification requirements that you were required to do, you've done. So great, you've had your audit, you got your compliance letter, everything's good. Keep doing what you're doing. You're doing it right. You could receive a notice of suspect documents. So this would let you know that based on their review of the I-9s and all the documentation that was submitted by employees, that they might determine that the documentation presented by a certain employee does not either relate to that employee or might not be valid for employment. So this advises the employer of possible criminal and civil penalties for continuing to employ unauthorized workers. So they'll provide the employer and the employee an opportunity to provide documentation demonstrating that they are eligible for U.S. work authorization. So if they find something is not quite right, they will give everyone a chance to correct it. But if it's not able to be corrected, then further steps will take. They could give you a notice of discrepancies. And this lets you know that based on the review of your I-9s and all of the related documentation that you have for your employees, that they were unable to determine an employee's eligibility to work in the United States. So the employer would provide the employee with a copy of the notice, as well as an opportunity to present additional documentation back establishing valid U.S. work authorization. So they are not saying that the documentation is wrong, like the notice of suspect documents. They're saying that they're not able to determine whether this is right. They do need additional information to clear everybody and say, yes, this person is able to work in the U.S. or not. Then you might get a notice of technical or procedural failures. And this identifies any failures found during the inspections of the I-9, and it gives the employers 10 business days at least to correct the forms. And then after this correction period ends, anything that's uncorrected as a technical or procedural failure will become a substantive violation. So if they find that every single one you filled out one thing wrong on every form, they're going to say, hey, somewhere in your procedure, you didn't train people how to fill this out, or your software is doing the same mistake over and over and over again. And so they're going to let you know, hey, this needs to be fixed. Your technology, your system needs to be corrected to do the right process, or your process internally needs to be corrected. And then they give you time to go back through and correct all of those I-9s. And then they're going to come back and look and say, hey, did you fix the problem? If that happens, they're going to let you know what part's not working right. And that's okay. You have time to fix it. Go ahead and fix it. You might get a warning notice. A warning notice is issued when they find a lot of verification violations. They've found these issues before and they weren't corrected, and that there is an expectation that the employer be compliant in the future. So a warning notice should not be issued when the employer was previously the subject of a warning notice, or they got an intent to fine, whether the employer was notified of procedure failures and failed to correct them, or the employer had just not prepared anything, gotten anything together in that 3 days when they were told to prepare for an audit. Then you could get a notice of intent to fine. Now, this may be issued for substantive violations. So you had uncorrected technical or procedure failures. Again, they let you know, hey, this system somewhere along the line is just not going right. And then you chose not to correct it. Or if you knowingly hire people who are not allowed to work, they don't have authorization to work within the United States, or that we continue to employ people even when the paperwork, we don't get that receipt, we don't have that re-verification. So the notice of intent to fine is going to let us know, hey, you didn't take care of the things you needed to, you're going to receive some fines. So you want to make sure that you're implementing regular I-9 audits internally. So if you're implementing I-9 audits internally, you're hopefully able to catch and fix these issues before you have an official inspection. You want to consider maybe using E-Verify if it's required in your state or in your industry, or for additional compliance. Again, it does not take the place of the I-9, but it does give you additional verification of work authorization. And then you want to be proactive about your I-9 compliance, because the penalties can range from hundreds to thousands of dollars per violation. So let's talk about what some of those penalties are. You are required to complete and retain an I-9 form for every employee. If you don't, it could result in significant civil and criminal penalties. So what are some of the civil violations? Civil violations would be you knowingly hired or you knowingly recruited an unauthorized alien for employment in the United States, or you continued to employ an unauthorized alien in your workforce in the U.S. Maybe you failed to comply with the I-9 employment verification requirements. Maybe you committed or participated in document fraud so you could satisfy the requirement of employment verification process. Maybe you could be found civilly liable for committing document abuse, liable for unlawful discrimination against an employment authorized individual in your hiring, firing, or recruitment practices. The civil penalties for I-9 violations. So just on the paperwork. So we're just talking about the forms. We talked about a couple of civil penalties for knowingly hiring someone or recruiting someone who you knew was not eligible to work in the United States. But if we're talking just about the form, the paperwork violations, they occur when employers fail to properly complete, retain, or make the I-9 form available for inspection. And for each individual with a substantive violation or uncorrected technical error, the fines range from $288 to $2,861 each time you have a paperwork violation. It's a lot of money. This is why those internal audits are really worth it. But let's talk about if you knowingly hire or continue to employ unauthorized workers. These penalties escalate every time there's a repeated offense. So your first offense, your fines are going to range anywhere from $716 to $5,724 per unauthorized worker. Your second offense, that ranges from $5,724 to $14,308 per unauthorized worker. The third time, your fines can range anywhere from $8,586 to $28,619 per unauthorized worker. These are massive fines for continuing to employ unauthorized workers or knowingly hiring somebody who's unauthorized to work in the U.S. So think about that re-verification process. If you don't complete that re-verification process, maybe the person did not go and request an extension of their work authorization or didn't do what they needed in order to have continuing work authorization, and you never went back and completed that I-9 re-verification section, and that person is no longer authorized to work within the United States, that is your offense. You're talking about fines just on a first offense for a single employee could be $5,700. So it's really important that we're taking the I-9 seriously and that we're maintaining them correctly and we're following up with anybody who has an expiration date to their work authorization timeframe. So there are a lot of factors that influence the penalty assessment. So they are going to think about several factors. They're going to think about your business size. Smaller businesses may receive reduced fines. If you have a good faith effort, you've demonstrated that you're trying to comply and that you're trying to correct anything that had happened, could really help mitigate some of those penalties. They're going to look at the violation seriousness. If you have more severe violations, you're going to have higher fines because it's a pattern of not doing the items correctly. And then when they look at history of previous violations, so if you've been audited before and you're still making the same errors, then being a repeat offender, you're going to face stricter penalties. Now, criminal penalties could come into play. And they come into play when you are engaging in a pattern or practice of hiring unauthorized workers, when you are knowingly doing it and knowingly doing it for a reason. It could lead to criminal charges, including fines and imprisonment. So beyond the fines, beyond everything, what are some of the other things that could happen? Well, if you're a government contractor, you could lose your government contracts. You could have some payback orders, so you might have to compensate affected individuals. So if you required certain documents from an employee, which you're not allowed to do, or you made hiring and employment decisions based on their identity and work authorization, you could be fined and have to pay back any money that that person lost because of that. And you might have a mandate to hire or rehire anyone that was discriminated against in that process. So we do want to know that all of the dollar amounts that we gave, those are recent adjustments. So the Department of Homeland Security, just on January 2nd of 2025, adjusted all of those civil monetary penalties for inflation. So on their website, you can find what those penalties will be at any time, and we have a link in our episode guide, but those are the current prices as of 2025. So what can trigger an I-9 audit? I mean, it definitely doesn't sound like anything fun, but what usually triggers it? And commonly, an ICE audit comes because either you're selected randomly or routinely for a compliance check. It can also be triggered from a tip or a complaint about unauthorized workers. A business could be involved in federal contracts that have e-verify requirements, and it kind of pushes you kind of up on the list of that random selection just to verify that you're following the rules of that federal contract. Or you might have a previous violation or investigation, and that they might need to come back around and make sure that you've completed everything that you were supposed to correct. Quick question. What happens if you complete the I-9 properly, you retain the I-9 form in an organized manner, you're able to have it available in case you get audited, everything on there is correct, you've filled it out properly, it's secure, but DHS discovers that your employee is not actually authorized to work? What happens? Well, you have a very good faith defense against the imposition that you knowingly hired an unauthorized individual. You can show that you did everything you could to verify the work authorization. And unless the government can show that you had knowledge that that employee was unauthorized, then that is going to become an issue of the employee and the government, and not you and the government. So yes, it's possible that we do everything. We look at the documents, they look real to us. Everything we've tried to do looks correct. We've filed the form, we did our regular audits, made sure all the information was correct. But sometimes you can't tell. And as long as you can show that you tried and they can't find any other way you knew that that employee was unauthorized, then you should feel good that you have a defense of that and it won't come back on you as the business owner. So, best practices. How can you prepare for I-9 audits? Implement a compliance plan. Establish a regular audit schedule, quarterly, annually. Pick something so that you're going through and looking at these forms and making sure that they're correct. Train your HR and hiring personnel on the right way to complete an I-9, the right way to verify the identity and work authorization, and make sure they know how to complete that form. Make sure you're using an I-9 checklist during onboarding. Maybe make a cheat sheet so both your employee and employer know where they're supposed to fill things out and what items not to miss. Like those signatures that we talked about. And consider using E-Verify for additional verification and make sure that it's something that is applicable in your state or your industry. And then review and update your company I-9 policies. You should regularly and review and update any of your internal I-9 and employment verification policies. Now, I love policies and procedures. This is not the first time I've told you. I know that I love them. I love updating policies. I do like all that small print. It's good. But if you have policies on how people are supposed to be doing things or what the processes are, make sure that you're regularly reviewing those and updating them, because this establishes a clear protocol for retaining, storing, and updating. So that way you know when and how to do the employment authorization verifications, you know when and how to do the re-verifications, that you have compliance for any state-specific requirements, and that you develop a plan for what to do if you get the notice of the intent to audit. You know what to do and what to expect if one of those government agencies comes through to do an audit with you. How do you conduct an internal audit? Well, there's a couple things that you can do to ensure compliance and to make sure that you minimize any potential violations if you do have an official audit. So, first thing, make sure you have all your I-9 forms. Make sure you're not missing anyone. Print out a list of your current employees and any employees who left within the last 3 years, because if they worked for you for less than 2 years, you have to maintain that form for 3 years. So make sure you know who should have an I-9 form on file, and then go through and make sure you're not missing any of them. Make sure that they all got placed with your I-9 forms and that you didn't accidentally have one of them hanging out in the personnel files. Make sure that you have them organized by active employees and former employees. Also, you want to make sure you review them for accuracy. So check section 1. Did the employee put their name, address, and date of birth? Did they check the appropriate status, whether they're U.S. citizen, lawful permanent resident, etc.? If they need to, did they put their A number, their alien registration number in? Or did they have their work authorization expiration date included? Did they sign and date the form, and did they do that on or before their first day of work? Then check section 2. This is the part that the employer completes. Did we record all of the acceptable documents from the employee? Did we fill in the document titles? Did we fill in the issuing authority? The numbers, the expiration dates, are they all correct? Did we remember to sign it? That's a big thing. Employers really miss that signature line a lot. So, was it signed and dated by the employer within 3 business days of the employee's start date? And then if we have any rehires or we have any re-verifications, did we complete that section 3 supplement B now? Did we complete that section? Did we put in all of the information and record it accurately? If we got a receipt, did we then follow up and get the actual document and cross out receipt and put the right information in? So if we do find in our internal audit that we have a lot of problems there, did we identify and correct the errors? Again, minor errors, draw a single line through the incorrect information, write the correct information next to it, then initial and date it. Do not backdate it. And then write up an explanation for why that was done and keep it with the I-9 form. If you want, you can go to our website, meithsolutions.info, meithsolutions.info, and you can download our I-9 audit checklist. So a link is in our episode guide, and you can go to our website, and we have a free I-9 audit checklist that you can download. So what are some of the benefits for completing these I-9 forms beyond compliance? Beyond not getting fined and hopefully not having to go through audits, but what are some of the other benefits? Really, when you're thinking about it, we have the legal compliance and the avoiding all of those penalties. It helps us comply with federal law, it reduces our risks and penalties, and ensures that we're not knowingly employing unauthorized workers. But it also protects us from discrimination claims. When we complete the I-9 forms properly and fairly for all employees, it protects against discrimination lawsuits. It demonstrates that our hiring decisions are based on valid documentation rather than assumptions about work eligibility. It really strengthens our workforce integrity. It helps us know that we are hiring legally authorized workers. We are reducing our risk of employment fraud. We're preventing identity theft issues. So we are strengthening the integrity of our workforce. And it's easier for us to comply with other government programs like E-Verify. If we are participating in E-Verify, the I-9 form is the basis of that electronic verification. And it really streamlines our employee record keeping and audits. Organizing our I-9s helps us speed up the internal audits. It helps us simplify all of our requirements for government inspections. It reduces confusion. And then it also enhances our business reputation. It shows that we are law-abiding and ethical, that we are credible with our employees and with our communities. And it really protects us from bad press and reputational damage. So what are our key takeaways today? We need to implement regular internal I-9 audits to make sure we are catching and fixing issues before an official inspection. So earlier on, we talked about a link in our episode guide for a handbook for employers. Now, the USCIS created the Handbook for Employers M-274. Again, link is in our episode guide. This handbook goes through every aspect of the I-9 form, goes through best practices, goes through retention requirements, it details out lists of acceptable documents, and goes further with details on what acceptable receipts can be submitted. But most importantly, it has document examples with both current and previous versions of documents. This includes, they have examples of images of documents like driver's license, like passports, like work authorization forms. So they have images of those documents, images of those cards, images of those forms, and anything else on the list of acceptable documents. It will show you both current and previous versions. So if someone has an older document, you can go and see a picture of it and say, yes, this looks like that document. But they also go further where they have brief explanations of what you're going to see on those documents, where to look on those documents for specific information that you're going to need to complete the I-9 form correctly. That guide, both the handbook itself and then most importantly, the document examples, are absolutely priceless in ensuring that we're filling out these forms correctly. And it gives us assistance so we can make sure that we are correctly authenticating the documents that are being presented to us. So, Handbook for Employers M-274 on the USCIS.gov website. Go into their I-9 Central, look for the Handbook for Employers M-274. We hope you enjoyed this week's episode. Send us an email at hrtoolboxpod@gmail.com to suggest topics and let us know what tools you are looking for to improve your workplace. Subscribe now and join us every other Monday as we explore the tools, resources, and strategies that can transform your business. Follow the HR Toolbox on socials at HR Toolbox Pod, and follow us to stay up to date with the latest HR Toolbox resources and news. See you in the next episode. Don't let anyone put a wrench in your week.